Hello and welcome to our 5 minutes with Ekaterina Russian poetry. Our poetess for today is Anna Akhmatova. She is the brightest representative of silver age of Russian poetry, and lots of people who knows the poetry well and who knows Russian language would tell you that it is her who is the greatest poetess in Russian literature ever. She herself defined her as a poet, not poetess, because at the time when she was living, there was a myth that poetess cannot write serious writings. She was born in the upper-class family in Ukraine near Odessa in 1889. And when she was only 1 year old, her family moved to St. Petersburg. Her life was very unsettled, but the city, St. Petersburg, was the only thing that was stable during the long 76 years of her life. During these 76 years, more than 30 years, she was silenced by government. And despite that, her poetry was quoted, memorized, distributed in handwritings, and she had such a huge love of the people of her time that it's hard to imagine. Her personal life was very difficult. She firstly experienced the divorce of her parents. She had to move from St. Petersburg from the Tsar's village to Ukraine, where she spent 3 years of her education. She firstly studied in homeschooling in Yevpatoria, and then she moved to Kiev, where was the law school for women. She attended for 2 years, and then she realizes that she cannot live separately from St. Petersburg, and she is going back there. At the city lives famous at the time poet Nikolai Gumilev, who loves Anna from the teenager's age. He offers her his love, and she rejected the proposal of marriage for 3 times. During the years of this communication, they were common in poetry. She starts to write poetries, and her father is saying that the family name shouldn't be dirted in it. Poetry is not serious thing for a young lady. So he forbids to write her own name, which was Gorenka, surname Gorenka. Under her poetry, she picks surname Akhmatova belonging to her grandmother, with which connected family stories that Ahmad was one of the bloodline children of Chinggis Khan, which we don't know if it's true. Finally, she marries Nikolai Gumilev, and they went to Paris twice. There she meets Amadeo Modigliani, and she falls in love so badly that several of her best poetries are dedicated to this painter, who at the time wasn't famous at all. Of course, this affair and other affairs which Anna had, and the passion of Nikolai for travels. He traveled to Africa, for example, multiple times, and they were separated for a long time. It wasn't a very good basement for their relationships. Shortly after having a common child, Lev, in 1912, they would separate. That would happen in 1918, but talking about 1912, this year is also significant because the first collection of poetries written by Anna was published in St. Petersburg. It brings her a lot of fame, it brings her glory, and soon after that the second collection of poetry is also edited and published. It's a big luck that it's happened before the revolution, before Bolsheviks came to power, because immediately after they would do it, they will silence her, they will try to silence her for the first time. Let's read one of the poems of this period together. Anna herself said that it's childish and naive, but still this part of her creativity, this spirit of her creativity, by modern people is considered as the best one. Let's read it together. «Я не любви твоей прошу, она теперь в надежном месте. Поверь, что я твоей невесте ревнивых писем не пишу. Но мудрые прими советы, дай ей читать мои стихи, дай ей хранить мои портреты, ведь так любезны женихи. А этим дурочкам нужней сознание полное победы, чем дружбы светлые беседы и память первых нежных дней. Когда же счастье гроши ты проживешь с подругой милой, и для пресыщенной души все станет сразу так постыло, в мою торжественную ночь не приходи, тебя не знаю, и чем могла б тебе помочь? От счастья я не исцеляю». Despite her lyrics was very romantic, there was something not said, and everybody can attach it to their own experience. After Bolsheviks came, they decided that this poetry is not worth Soviet poetry, and the worst thing started to happen. Her ex-husband Nikolai was arrested and killed by the regime, and she married again, and her husband was arrested. Lots of people around her were arrested. Lots of people emigrated, and she didn't know their whereabouts after that. So she's entering such a stressful period of her life that lots of sadness, lots of anger, and lots of some bad feelings are entering her poetry. And starting from 30s, where so-called ежовщины started, which meant that lots of people were arrested, the so-called clearance were happening. Ежовщина is because the Minister of Internal Affairs at the time was Ежов. And that was the time where she was constantly scared, and she constantly expecting that somebody who is close to her would be arrested. And that exactly happened to her third husband and to her son. Her son, her only child, was taken from her being very young, almost teenager, and he spent in total 10 years in Soviet camps and in Soviet prisons. Till the rest of his life, he wouldn't forgive her because he thought that she didn't do enough for him in order to get him free, which wasn't true, and it's a very big miracle that she wasn't arrested herself. But during this first arrest, she was staying in line in order to give him some food for the at the prison. The prison is called Kresty, crosses. It still exists in St. Petersburg. And there she met a lady, as she remembered afterwards, which inspired her or motivated her in writing poetries, which in Russia will be published in 1985. She was writing them in 1938, and they would be published only years and years later, even the years later after her death. Let's firstly read the story itself as Akhmatova remembers it, and then one of the poems of this cycle. В страшные годы ежовщины я провела 17 месяцев в тюремных очередях в Ленинграде. Как-то раз кто-то опознал меня. Тогда стоящая за мной женщина с голубыми губами, которая, конечно, никогда в жизни не слыхала моего имени, очнулась от свойственного нам всем оцепенения и спросила меня на ухо. Там все говорили шепотом: «А это вы можете описать?» Я сказала: «Могу». Тогда что-то вроде улыбки скользнуло по тому, что некогда было ее лицом. This lady talking to Akhmatova was in the great danger herself because the secret police could follow her, prosecute her, and kill. But she wanted these memories be conserved. And Anna is writing the poetries later collected in the cycle and called Requiem about these times, and she didn't write them down. There were no drafts, because even if the single draft would be found, she would be repressed, she will be imprisoned or killed. So she had to memorize them, and only after 20 years she wrote them down, and only after the death of Stalin in 1953 she could literally edit it and publish. Firstly, they were published abroad when she was still alive, and then only long years after her death they were published in Soviet Russia. Let's read one of the poems reflecting her own feelings, how she thought about herself being in this situation and how different it was from her young expectations as a young woman of a noble origin. Показать бы тебе, насмешнице и любимице всех друзей, царскосельской веселой грешнице, что случилось с жизнью твоей. Как 300-я с передачею под крестами будешь стоять и своей слезою горячею новогодний лед прожигать. Там тюремный тополь качается, и ни звука, а сколько там неповинных жизней кончается. Since this time her life was never happy, the Second World War started, and as you remember, the Leningrad was under blockade. Maybe you remember how we were reading together Olga Bergholz. You can still find the video on my channel. And Olga Bergholz met Anna Akhmatova in the beginning of the occupation to take the interview for the radio. She wrote in her diaries that Anna was in great distress, in a very bad physical and mental condition, living in the basement of a dead man, never having her own house. It was very dark, no windows, and a very bad smell. In order to write down the interview, they had to go up to a different room where they recorded, write down the words of Akhmatova, which were read by other person on the radio. Because of bad physical condition and of course mental condition, her son was still in prison. The doctors told that she should be evacuated, and she was evacuated on the east. But as soon as she could, she went back to Leningrad, and she tried to write some kind of Soviet poetries, even somehow saying that Stalin rule is good. She was writing letters even to Stalin. She wrote a letter to him, and one of the response in order her son to be free, and one of the response for this letter was the order to arrest her, which never happened. She was loved and famous, and they didn't do it. There were no proof, because all these political portraits, they were never published. And in 1940, publishing the collection of her poetries written during all the time, she was scolded, and because of intrigues, they again forbid to publish her. So the permission to publish her in Soviet times was before 30s, and then it was a short time during the war years where it was difficult to publish, or not that many people were reading poetry anyway. And then for the whole years of Stalinism, before the death of Stalin in 1953, she was banned from publishing. What she can do, she could translate different classic authors in order to support herself, in order to have some money for living. And she was writing the magazine articles about famous poets, including Alexander Pushkin. That's how she lived. And everything she was writing of her own poetries, they were writing in the table, so-called, so they were not published, and lots of them were lost when she was changing the places. She never had the house of her own until the very, very old age, when the government gave her the small dacha where you cannot live in winter anyway. In 1940, she is writing a poetry which is so depressive and which shows her ideas about afterlife. Но я предупреждаю вас, что я живу в последний раз. Ни ласточкой, ни кленом, ни тростником и ни звездой, ни родниковою водой Ни колокольным звоном не буду я людей смущать и сны чужие навещать неутоленным стоном. After the death of Stalin, she was able to publish some poetries, and that's how people who knew her before the war, who were in emigration, they figured out that she is still alive. They were surprised, and they helped her. She was invited abroad, she traveled, and she got the doctorate honor degree from Oxford University. And the collection of her poetries are published abroad. Her health is in a bad condition because of these experiences, because of all struggles she had to encounter, and her son doesn't talk to her. She will die in 1966 near the Moscow, where she was on rehabilitation for the heart disease. The government didn't want dissidents to make a good funeral for her, so she was transported by plane to St. Petersburg. They thought that there wouldn't be a big crowd, and they did everything in order people not to gather and wouldn't even inform anyone. But the crowd, despite this, was huge, and people who wanted to pay the last tribute the great poetess. One of her latest poetries shows that she was thinking about people who left this world before her. Что у нас общего? Стрелка часов и направление ветра. Или в глубине оснеженных лесов очерк мгновенного кедра. Сон, что как будто ошибся дверьми и в красоте невозвратной снился ни в чем не повинной. Возьми страшный подарок обратно. On the cemetery where she was buried, her son built a wall with a small window, which is symbolizing the time when she went to bring him some food in prison. Now she is famous, she is beloved, and her memory is very well perceived in the whole Russian-speaking world. Tell me what do you think about her life, tell me what do you think about her poetry, let's share our thoughts together. Thank you a lot for watching, thank you my dear patrons for supporting me on Patreon. If you're not with me there yet and you can, please consider this option, because that's how I know that these videos made the difference and you like them, and that motivates me to create more of them. Even if you can't, you can help the channel putting your likes and subscribing for it below. Thank you very much for watching, and I hope to meet you very soon. Goodbye.